Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Dev Diary, where today we continue trying to recreate the physics-based Tetris-like tricky towers in Game Maker. Now last time we managed to get the Tetris-like portion of the experience done, and after a grand realization of the tedious effort required to pull it off, we ended the session with the ability to place falling shapes onto a provided platform, which would all work using Game Maker's physics system. And today we aim to finish this project by adding some final bells and whistles, notably the remaining Tetris-like features. We'll also attempt to add a few of the defining characteristics that make Tricky Towers what it is. It's a giant platter of random features, really. So let's not waste any more time and get to finishing this remake. Now, much like in Tetris, Tricky Towers gives the player a heads up to the next shape that'll spawn, and our version was going to accomplish this with two variables. So, when a piece has officially been placed, the two variables are updated, with piece A inheriting piece B's data and piece B having a new shape chosen. This was then painstakingly drawn to the screen. After a bunch of tweaking to get the positioning right, we now had a very similar, albeit uglier and more simplistic, heads-up display for upcoming pieces. So, with that, it was on to the next feature. Next up was an attempt at the highlight effect that was meant to help guide placing shapes. The thing to note here is the fact that the highlight changes based on the width of the sprite. To match this, Game Maker's B-box variables were used, which, as explained in the documentation, would be calculated based on the sprite's mask. However, this evidently does not work with physical objects, despite the fact that these sprites are also set to use precise collision masks for each shape. I'll go more into detail later, but suffice to say, outside of doing some ridiculous hard coding, the highlight feature would have to be nixed. And so it was on to the next feature. Now last time we concluded that while majority of the experience was pretty similar, the fact that shapes wouldn't topple over no matter how they were stacked was a problem. And so a ridiculous amount of tweaking to the physical properties of these shapes were made. Nothing would work until I realized that fixed rotations are a toggle. I was under the impression it was like an addendum to control physical rotations. But as clearly shown, by disabling fixed rotations once a shape has been placed, finally lets physics work as intended. However, this introduced a new issue. Shape weight seemed less loaded. As a result, weight distribution seemed off and did not properly mirror that of Tricky Towers. And unfortunately, no matter how much poking around I did to the physical properties, I was unable to replicate the same behavior. So instead of wasting all session on the issue, the decision was made to move on. Next, two new variables for goal and end lines were added. These would be used to make the current goal height and impending doom lines featured in Tricky Towers, and would be displayed as such. I also want to apologize to those watching who may be triggered by the fact that the goal line is in fact not evenly positioned on the screen. Time was of the essence and patience was wearing thin. Anyway, back in the code, when a shape is placed, it would have its height position compared to the goal line. If higher, it would trigger a function to move the goal line to the next level and move the camera up. And of course, nothing worked for many reasons. First, I accidentally compared the shape's X position instead of its Y position. Next, the game's room is set to a single screen size, so moving the camera wasn't gonna work anyway. Instead, the update function was changed to not only move the goal, but once the goal line reached a threshold, the line would reset to the middle of the screen. This would also push the entire tower down, floor included, the same amount of space to give the illusion of the camera moving. The end results were an extremely janky mess, mostly thanks to the last-minute hack job-like nature of the changes made to the update function. Despite this, we were almost through adding the final features, so the end line would also check for its position compared to the goal line, and if below the goal line would slowly creep upward over time. No win or loss states were ever added, so this ended up working just fine, giving us a final total of basically 2 successes and 3 failures in terms of features additions this session. In retrospect, there is a lot I would have done different with what I know now. For one, each shape would have been its own sprite, and it would also likely have been drawn with an odd number of pixels, because rotating the sprite forced the collision shape to rotate, and I'm under the impression, given how awkward the shapes would interact sometimes, that the rotations would slightly offset by a pixel or two. Using individual sprites would have also solved the highlight issue, as they would have all had their own bounding boxes instead of sharing the same one. Again, despite each having different collision masks and Game Maker stating bounding boxes work off of collision masks. Anyway, the final thing I would have changed was the overall way that the goal line and everything associated with that system worked. The idea to have everything shift seemed like the best course of action, but the execution left a lot to be desired. I think the handling of shape-to-shape operations needed a buffer to allow for things like shifting and proper checks to be made. However, I cut a few corners for the sake of time, and they really came back to hurt the project later on. And the final obvious note I want to make is the fact that there's still a lot I need to learn about not only GameMaker's physics system, but physics in general. A general lack of understanding made it difficult to pin down the awkward shape behaviors and really added to the eventual mess that was our code. So overall, while I think the end results weren't all that bad, there's still a ton that could have been done better. A better plan and understanding of what I was getting into would have saved me a ton of time and headaches. However, on the other hand, it's all part of the learning process, and boy, did I learn a lot. So with that brings us to the end of this little experiment and today's episode of the Dev Diary. So if you enjoyed today's entry, consider leaving a like. Be sure to also subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, and let me know, what did you think of my approach to this Tricky Towers remake? What would have you done differently? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.